Hi, and welcome to the Compile Time podcast. So, if you were with us last season, this podcast was called the Design Doc. The name has changed. It won't change every season. Hopefully, this is the last time we need to change it. But the structure of the podcast is going to change a little bit too. So, with the last season, I had a guest on every time. We talked about things that they were experts at. That may change going forward with the Compile Time podcast with future seasons and this season. It might be me sometimes, and other times it might be me and a guest or a couple guests. So we're going to be a little bit more flexible with the content. But today I do have a guest. I've got a dear friend of mine, Jacob Kastensmidt, and he's going to talk to us about web components. Jake, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, hello. Glad to be on. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Yeah, of course. So I always like to start with just a really basic question, which is why don't you tell us about yourself and how long you've been in software development?
Yeah, so I've been in, I actually had to look it up today because I figured it might be asked. It's 8 years now. I wasn't aware of that. But yeah, I've been in the field professionally for 8 years. Primarily, I work in front end engineering. Technically, I'm labeled as a full stack engineer, but most of my work is done in the front end. And that's been pretty consistent throughout my career, even though I'm rather comfortable in the back end. But yeah, and then I would say the last 2 or 3 years, my main focus has been accessibility on the front end.
Hey, that's great. That's definitely something we should talk about too as we get into this. So you're working with web components. What are you building with web components?
Yeah. So the company I work at, we had a library that was built in Vue, and it was most of our, your pretty staple pieces of a website. You've got the header, the footer, um, custom links, pagination, tabs, all that kind of stuff. Just trying to make sure we are standardizing across the company. And that was originally in Vue 2. With Vue 2 going to end of life, we were looking at it, and our options were update to Vue 3 and only support that. Or since a lot of teams were looking at trying out other technologies, we were trying to find something that was framework agnostic. And web components have been around for about 10 years. There's been different libraries come and gone for helping with it, but at the time, I'd been heavily looking at a library called Lit, Lit. You can visit their documentation at lit.dev. Um, but yeah, helped work on a website, my spare time, build only in Lit, and thought it might be a really good solution.
That's awesome. That leads me to so many questions. So I guess the first thing, so you mentioned that you have a component system that was originally written in Vue, and you've been migrating that to web components, right?
hmm
So would you mind just talking a little bit about like what a component system is and why that might be useful?
Yeah, I think the main piece is how rapidly it lets you develop. So, a component system essentially is the building blocks of a website. Your tabs, your header, your footer, any piece that you might regularly use on a web page, just as a reusable, easily consumable piece. I would liken it to, you know, when you're building Legos, the when it has you consume or build a few pieces all at once and then those go together. It's the multiple pieces of Lego together that go together to build something larger. But yeah. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Just more about component systems. I guess I'm kind
Yeah.
of poking towards one thing in particular. You mentioned
Mhm.
accessibility. How do component systems kind of help with accessibility? And I keep saying component systems. They're actually, I'm not sure why I'm saying that. They're way more commonly referred to as component libraries.
Yeah.
So I don't want to confuse people, but component library, component system, how does that kind of help with like accessibility as well?
Yeah. So there's definitely various aspects to that. With with a component library, you kind of solve accessibility in one place, and then just by consuming that piece that's already built, especially if it's maintained by a separate team that just their sole focus is making sure that you have very hardened, well made pieces for the website. You solve it once, and then you don't have to solve those issues again. not issues. That's the wrong way of looking at it. But you don't have to solve, um, the ideal way of setting up accessibility again.
Yeah,
You can just consume.
that's a problem, right? Like if a component's not accessible, that's a problem. So if someone else is solving that
Hmm.
problem, you don't have to solve it multiple times.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so circling back, so you mentioned web components, you mentioned lit. So it might be helpful to just kind of talk about what is a web component.
Yeah. It's essentially, if you boil it down to the very basics, it is a native browser API that registers JavaScript that will, when the browser comes across a tag, so a typical element tag, it has to be a two-word separated by a dash. Well, rather, at least a two-word separated by a dash, because single word elements are maintained for native browser support. So it registers to the browser, hey, for example, let's just say like test dash component. For test component, anytime you see that in the HTML markup, go through and replace it with this implementation that I've offered to you. And that implementation is written purely in JavaScript. So if you were to do it by hand, it would be, like document.create element, and you would just be appending elements to it. And then that would be appended to the document in such a format, not directly to the document, but it is created inside of a shadow root. So it uses the shadow DOM, which is a document fragment. Um, Essentially, it's like recreating the document, um, that then has a root node that attaches to the primary document. And the benefit that you get from this is the document fragment, it creates its own scope with CSS, JavaScript, a few other things. But primarily, what is I find most beneficial is the CSS, is scoped specifically to that document fragment. Um,
So
yeah. So, oh, go ahead.
everything has trade-offs, right? So I can definitely see the benefit to that, scoping the CSS just to that shadow DOM. What are some of the things people should be aware of if they're using web components with shadow DOMs, like gotchas or things that might not work the way they were expecting?
Yeah, the I think the biggest hang up my team has had has been with events. So you're probably familiar with, JavaScript events bubbling. When you're working with the shadow DOM, just bubbling won't cause that event to escape out of that document fragment. They also have to be composed. So whenever you're looking at an event and you're thinking you can just attach a listener to the element, you might not catch it because it won't escape that document. However, when you are creating custom events, um, you can mark them as composed, and they will then escape from that document fragment to the quote unquote light DOM. The
Yeah.
other part is there are parts of CSS that do trickle down into the shadow DOM, and those are primarily CSS custom properties, and then a few pieces of font. So the font that you're, or sorry, the your typeface and whatnot. So your font family will come through, your font size, different thing, line height, that kind of stuff.
Okay. So, man, that's a lot to take in. So you have the shadow DOM and you have the light DOM. So the light DOM is if I was just excuse me, if I was just coding with like HTML, I would be building everything in the light DOM.
Yeah,
And then
it
if I
is
wanted to
that like
use, go ahead.
yeah. I was gonna say yeah, it's your traditional DOM tree, that top level parent DOM tree.
Okay. And then if I use web components, I'm going to get a shadow DOM inside the light DOM where my web component is.
Yes, but you don't have to. You can also build web components without using the Shadow DOM. Um, and we have the team that I'm on right now. Before, when we had to support Internet Explorer, we had been doing that for a little bit. In that case, you do not get that benefit of the CSS isolation.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I can see that because everything's in the same document object model,
Hmm.
so it's just going to flow through.
The primary thing that you lose using it in that kind of like non-shadow root method is you're no longer allowed to use native slots. And the slots work very similarly to your slots in like React and Vue and those kind of frameworks.
Yeah, maybe there's a segue there. So if we think about web components, they're components, just like if you were to build a React component or a Vue component, but they're using native browser APIs, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, you register a script, it registers a web component with your DOM, and then whenever it finds that in the DOM, it plops it in, just like it would be if it was a React component, like a React tree.
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Similar to how you would have like the virtual tree in React. Instead, it just uses the actual DOM, and when it finds those components, it replaces it with the proper implementation.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's definitely some benefit there, right? So from a component perspective, you don't have to recreate the same accordion over and over again, and you're not doing it with jQuery, which is really nice. What other benefits do you have to like? What benefits do web components bring?
That's a good question. I would definitely say the reusability is a huge piece, especially the ease of use of reusability, since I'm not having to directly copy and paste over some HTML. The other the reason my team is currently building in web components is definitely the framework agnosticism. Them being framework agnostic, meaning they're not tied to React or Vue. Most modern frameworks have good support for good and improving support for web components, native web components, that is. Also referred to sometimes as custom elements. But sometimes they might have like a setting that you have to turn on just so that your library recognizes that there is web components. So when they're looking through, they're not trying to compare them to their own catalog of registered components. They're recognizing this as one that the browser is going to provide.
Yeah,
Um,
that
but yeah.
makes a lot of sense. I want to touch on the front end ecosystem a little later, actually,
Mhm.
but I do want to circle back to one thing. So you said when you're building a web component, you would just once it's been registered, right? You would just add it to the DOM via an HTML tag, so
Yeah.
an element tag. So if I wanted like my accordion and my component was called my dash accordion, I would just add that just like I would a div, and then it might have some children, it might have some properties or attributes or something, right?
Yes. Yeah. And properties can be defined. Um, There, I actually I've been using lit so much. I don't know how much of the property reactivity is built into the native web component and what is built into lit. However, using a and lit is a very small library, but using something like lit, those attributes on the element can be set as reactive to make sure you're rebuilding when they change, and they can be read from within the web component, similar to like a Vue prop or a React prop, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's so. So you mentioned lit again. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what lit is?
Yeah, lit is a very lightweight library. It's I would mostly just say it's some syntactical sugar to using web components. So rather than having to, previously I'd mentioned document.create element and chain a bunch of create elements together. It allows you to use string literals to define your HTML. It gives you some reactivity with stateful properties as well as stateful attributes. And yeah, it's mostly syntactical sugar. It's kind of the sequel, I guess you might call it, to um,
Polymer,
the
right?
live. Yeah, Polymer. Yeah, the name fell out of my head for a moment. Yeah, it's the same team as far as I'm aware that built Polymer, but it was different enough that they didn't want to just call it Polymer version 2. So they rebranded as Lit. And from as far as I'm aware, Lit was a temporary name that then just stuck.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is it? LIT, Long Island Iced Tea? What are we? Or is it just called Lit? I
Oh no, there actually is an anagram to it. I don't remember what it is.
Interesting. I'll have to dig that up because now I'm very curious. So I guess another question that comes to mind is like, who should use web components?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of use cases for them. There's also some places that you want to kind of steer clear, that I've learned and just working with them for the past year and a half or so. So you typically want to try, and I think search engines are better about this at this point, but content that is search engine optimized, so part of your SEO, you want to tend to keep out of web components unless they are like children of the element, just to make it easier for robots to crawl that content. Typically your smart robots nowadays will fully render the page with JavaScript and everything, but it can still be safe to keep that outside just in case you are running into a search engine that does not optimize for that.
So
Um,
I've done
Go ahead.
a little bit with Lit, not nearly as much as you. So I might say something wrong here, and please correct me if I do. But is that because you have like the template literals aren't being necessarily rendered on page load as part of like the server side rendered payload that's coming back, or is it because things could change when you use like a lifecycle method, like connected callback? Like, what's the hold up there?
Yeah, so without any extra work, whenever a page is delivered, before JavaScript takes over, you just have that tag on the page. Nothing else is being rendered, and maybe the attributes that are inside of that tag. But it can be difficult for a without proper syntax added to it for a search engine to recognize which part of the page that's meant to be. There is alternatives to help support this. For example, there is an initiative by Google that has a ton of traction and I believe is in all current major browsers, and that is called the declarative shadow. And that will put the template actually in, and start rendering the component before JavaScript is able to take over. So it's the necessary CSS and necessary HTML elements that is configured server side and then delivered within the component.
That's really cool. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah. Um, Lit has, again, if you use Lit, I highly recommend it. But you can learn a lot by directly working with native web components. But if you use Lit, they have a package called it's at lit/ssr, installable with npm. And it handles a lot of that generating the declarative shadow for you. It is technically still a Lit lab, so I don't know if I would recommend it immediately for production, but it's getting pretty close.
So is that their experimental packages or something? Maybe.
Yep, the labs are all their experimental packages.
Gotcha. And you mentioned that you could do it. You could build a web component without Lit. That would just be using the native browser APIs, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
It it is a little clunky at this moment, I would say. That's why I like using a library like Lit. Um, I typically liken it to I know jQuery kind of has a bad rap nowadays, but I liken it to when JavaScript was frustrating to work with like CSS selectors and things like that before we had you know our nice suite of modern browser APIs. When jQuery really made that a lot easier.
Okay.
So,
So
but
you've
lighter.
heard it here. Lit is the jQuery of web components.
I don't know if I want. I don't think I want that quote attributed to me, but I put it out in the world now.
I don't disagree with you for what it's worth. Again, I've done very, very little with Lit, but I have done a little. And from what I've seen, I would say that's fair. It's like a nice little layer over the native browser APIs to make them just a little nicer to work with.
Yeah, just some syntactical sugar.
Okay, so So we talked a little bit about who should use web components. Do you have any more? If you have more cases, I'd be happy to hear that. But I'm also really curious about who shouldn't.
Yeah. Uh, so again, I think there's really not a reason against them unless you're looking very hard for that server side rendered experience. Um, but I would say who shouldn't. There can be some hangups with like integrating with Next since it is server side rendering. If you want everything server side rendering, um, the it is getting better, and my team has been working pretty hard on making sure we're supporting it. But it's a difficult process to get full server-side rendering with web components, just because you have to be careful when in their life cycles you're calling browser APIs. But I would say, especially if you're supporting multiple frameworks or framework agnostic, um, we have an internal site, my job, that is completely built with Lit using something called the Vaadin router. It's Vaadin. Um, so it's definitely possible to create a full, single page application with just web components. Um, I don't know if I would hesitate anyone against it. I would just be aware of the areas you don't want to be using them. Like I said, primarily with SEO important pieces.
Gotcha.
Um, but having something that can go between frameworks and maintains style completely separate from the rest of the style sheet, uh, extremely useful to have.
Yeah, kind of having those components encapsulated and being able to, like you said, span multiple frameworks seems really beneficial. I guess one thing that comes to mind, and this is maybe a bit of a stretch on the question of who shouldn't, but Lit is or web components are they're not necessarily newer. Like you said, they've been around for 10 years, but they're maybe not the most popular thing. And
Yes.
it's hard for me to say maybe don't use it because it's not popular. But I guess what I'm getting at is if you are someone who needs a lot of documentation or blogs or video content to kind of help you get through it, there's not a lot of resources out there, right?
No, not too much. It's gaining more popularity, and I really do think it's going to be a technology we're going to see more and more of as we progress. You know, if you're aware, or yeah, if you're aware of Font Awesome, the library, and
Hmm.
the Awesome family, they recently acquired a component library, formerly Shoelace. Now it is, I think, Web Awesome is the name it's going by, but it is a completely web component library. So like, you know, people are seeing the value of this technology and starting to invest in it. But that said, at this current time, there might be times where you run into issues that are going to either be really hard to find the solution to, or you might be making the solution to. um, so if you are somebody that needs a little more of that like documentation support, that said, you know the I know a really good social space for getting help with it is the Lit Discord. um, and yeah, I think the more they're used, the more we're going to see support for them. But yeah, they've been out for 10 years. It's weird that they're only just now catching on, but I do think this is like the next big browser step that we're taking.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know, like, so if we rewind to 10 years ago, we're talking 2014. I know that when I was doing web development in 2014, we would constantly hear about new things being added to browsers, which meant new things being added to Chrome. And the other browsers were just not keeping up. So I know that that's not so much an issue anymore, but I imagine that, if they were introduced 10 years ago, they were probably introduced in Chrome 10 years ago, and then it took the other browsers 3 or 4 years to get caught up. Maybe I don't know. I would need to actually look at the history, but
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure on the history on web components and where they originated, browser wise.
okay. So you mentioned Next.js. I guess I had a question kind of about how web components fit into the larger front end ecosystem. we've kind of teeter tottered around this a little bit. So you mentioned that they work with React, they can work with Vue. I would assume they can work with Svelte, they can work with Solid, any of those front end things. And you don't need a front end framework either, right? Like you
Yeah.
can just write it in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Yep. You just have to import the JavaScript.
So you did mention that you ran into SSR issues with Next with web components.
Mhm.
Is that just Next, or is it just server side generation in general?
I would say it's server side generation in general. The reason Next was on my mind is it's just the primary framework that my team has been interfacing with for solving the server side solution. But as I said, Lit has options available for that, like the Lit Lab for Lit SSR. There's also a Lit package specifically designed for Next. Um, but then we originally built our components, we weren't entirely considering an SSR. So some of this has been, oh, well, we just need to move things to their proper life cycle, or do we even need to be calling a web API right here? Maybe functionality can be swapped out with CSS instead, and even hey, we're hitting a performance benefit from that.
Gotcha. Yeah, trying to find browser APIs in Node or something when it's running can definitely
Hmm.
cause some issues. So in on that vein, there are lifecycle methods with lit components, just like there are React components. Well, hooks
Hmm.
have kind of sort of replaced those, but um, so how do you like if you want something to run just in the browser and not on the server? How do you like? What's the process for doing that in lit?
In Lit, there is so the only like the primary um, lifecycle methods that trigger on the server side for Lit is constructor and render. Those are the two primary things. Beyond that, like connective callback, which if you're familiar with Vue, would be similar to your attached. Actually, no, sorry, it'd be more like mounted rather, um, or your first updated, which is a lifecycle that uh, triggers whenever the first full update on a client side renderer triggers, or updated, which is just the generalized version of that. Those all run client side, so any code that you put in those are only going to run client side.
Okay, that makes sense. And so you mentioned constructors, so that implies to me that they're class-based. Web
Yes.
components are. Is there a way to do
Yes.
them without classes? Like if you wanted to take a like in React, you can write function components. Is there a way to do that with lit or web components?
I don't actually know. I have not tried it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I know a lot of the lit decorators are designed for classes. I would imagine it's possible to do with functions using the native APIs, but I've not attempted to do it myself.
Gotcha. That makes total sense. I kind of forgot that lit was so decorator heavy,
Yeah.
and yeah, the classes totally make sense for that. So if we take a step back and maybe not so much thinking about lit in particular, um, how do you define what should or shouldn't be a web component? Whether you're using lit, maybe it's not even a web component, maybe it's just a component.
Mhm.
Whether that's lit or React or Vue or whatever. How do you define a boundary for what is a good component?
This is actually something that um, I have been thinking on more and more, now that year and a half into writing a web component library. There's definitely pieces that I think are inside of our library that probably shouldn't be, like the header, because of how much SEO content is inside of that, and just trying. It's such a, for us, a very large and complex piece, that I think web component might not be the ideal solution there. However, I would say any like reusable smaller pieces, especially pieces that are near, or yeah, near to like browser level components, like your input fields, things like that, that just need a little bit more on top. I think that's the ideal situation that you'll use web components in. Beyond, for like broader uh, framework and library speaking, your Reacts, your views. I know those are, typically everything is a component. But I think the best thing is to isolate the small building pieces of your site. And that might even start with conversations with, if you have a designer on your team or something like that. It might start with conversations at that level of, hey, does it make sense to make this a reusable pattern across our site and unify the aesthetic for it across, and interactions and all that across that component?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. I guess thinking about it, I always like the idea of components to like little Lego blocks or building bricks or something.
Hmm.
And good components to me are composable. So you can take a component and compose it into, or compose several components into a bigger component as well.
Yeah,
Do you,
I think.
yeah, do you think that that's a good pattern, or is that something that like maybe people should just export the smallest components and allow consumers to build with those, and they can build their own bigger components?
I think there's benefit to both. Having so I think if you're building yourself, you're probably building those smaller reusable pieces. I see no reason not to expose those, unless like a brand guide, dictates that that's not the case. But um, yeah, I think you're 100% on the right target with the composable piece. The Lego brick kind of composable. Here is your like set of building blocks, go ahead and build something. And you're probably going to build faster than you were, had you just started on your own.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of interesting to think of that, because I guess if you think of coding, it's like you're opening a big box of like a Lego Millennium Falcon and all the pieces are scattered together. But if you start thinking about components, maybe the Lego Millennium Falcon, when you dump the box out, it's already got like the cockpit assembled, and it's got like the thrusters assembled and the landing gears assembled. And then you're just able to move a lot faster because you have these larger pieces that are substantial pieces, and you can just put them together. And I mean, kind of, maybe that's a bad example because that kind of takes the fun away from Legos. But the idea being like, if your goal is just to build it and build it fast, you have those bigger components, those bigger pieces to work with, and you can assemble them much quicker because you're working with larger chunks of Legos code.
Yeah, I think it just depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it for fun, maybe that's not, the ideal. However, if your job is to produce 1,000 Millennium Falcons a day, maybe you want to look on some time saves. And I think that's where like the reusability really shines. Is there's no reason every time you need a wheel to reinvent the wheel. Just like every time there's a link, you don't need to reinvent the link.
Yeah, I like that. I think also you mentioned Shoelace. I didn't realize they got bought and are rebranding. But one of the
Yeah.
things that appealed to me when I first started learning about web components was how Shoelace is essentially trying to build components that they feel browsers should have. So things like accordions or other. I really can't think of any more examples off the top of my head, but the idea of like Shoelace being this thing that you can pull in because we're going to help you with the components that we feel browsers should have, but they don't.
Yeah, and for stuff like for accordions, we're starting to see more browser support for things like detail summary elements and stuff like that. But those aren't the most feature rich pieces. So when you need customization, stuff like Shoelace allows for a lot more. I guess WebAwesome now allows for a lot more of that.
Yeah, this is such a tangent, but since you mentioned detail summary, I'm kind of curious. Have you used the dialog browser API or element, whatever it is?
Yeah, I actually rebuilt the one for um, my my job's component library using that element, and I had to undo that because of, I think it was Safari support. Um, yeah, it's
If
interesting.
Safari wasn't a problem, do you feel like it's hitting the mark? Like, is that what we would expect from a dialogue?
I think so. As long as you don't need to customize it too terribly much. Um, so it uses something called, I think it's top level. So it's not a Z index. It's a layer entirely separate from the rest of the browser. um, that you cannot put anything custom on outside of calling, what is it, dialogue dot, I don't remember the method immediately, but dialogue calling full screen for a component, or sorry, for an element, um, and a few other browser APIs. But there's no way to be like, hey, just, this thing I just made, just go ahead and put it on the top level. That said, there's a lot of customization offered through some of the new pseudo elements that they've made for that. I know there's one for the backdrop for customizing that. Um, but as like a basic dialogue, I think it gets most of what you need.
That's cool. I was hesitant that they were. I was thrilled that they were looking to add more rich elements to the
Hmm.
browsers, especially since they'll be ideally accessible by default. And I just I don't know. I also had doubts that it was going to be something that many people would want to use. I feel like for a while we had with HTML5 we had some new elements come in that people were really excited about, and now I feel like we see very little of them because they just were missing the mark. But I have not kept up on that as much as I should have. So I was just curious if you had and how you felt about dialogues, because that felt like a good candidate to see just generally how those new elements are doing.
Yeah, and then also of note, I know it has a separate display mode that doesn't use the top layer, so it just like displays it, and you have to handle the rest of the overlay and that bit. But
Gotcha.
yeah, I think it's hitting the mark of like, if you just need a basic dialogue, this is going to be exactly what you need, and you're going to probably be able to get it on brand for what you need. But
But that's good then, and that's nice
mhm.
because dialogues are something that are easy to mess up, and a lot of times people will default to pulling in external libraries like floating UI to do
Yeah,
dialogues properly, and like if it's another external library you don't have to pull in anymore, which is always nice.
yeah. Floating UI is actually what we went back to when we realized Safari's not going to have the support right now. Like I
Uh,
said, I think it's Safari. I apologize to all the Safari devs if that's not the case. Um,
well, there's always a browser that's lagging behind. So it's if it's not Safari, it's Opera, and if it's not Opera, it's Chrome, and if it's or it's not, it's rarely Chrome. But the point being, there's always one.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I speaking of floating UI, another tangent. I saw that the developers behind Skeleton, which is a UI toolkit for Svelte, just ported, not ported, but did a what's the right way to explain this? Uh, it's not a port, but it's floating UI for Svelte, basically.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, I'm excited to see that enter the Svelte ecosystem.
Nice. And you said that skeleton, is that correct?
Yeah, Skeleton is the component library, and
Okay,
then they just added a new project to their roster that's outside of Skeleton, but it's Svelte floating UI.
cool. I'll have to check that out after this.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll tangent, but we actually are getting close to time. So I just a couple more questions.
Mhm.
We've talked a lot about web components. Are there any good guides, tutorials, or documentation that you would recommend for people who are interested in learning more about web components?
Yeah. Google has a lot of good documentation on it. I think they've kind of been sort of spearheading a lot of the web component custom element field. Um, Lit's documentation is very good. Again, it's at lit.dev. Um, Not just for their specific library, but also as an introduction to web components in general. Um, and there's a lot of helpful people within their Discord as well.
Cool. I will try to add those to the show notes as well. So what are you working on anything else outside of web components? Anything for fun? How do you get ideas for what you want to work on?
Yeah, outside of work, I'm not working on too much right now. I'm actually trying to build my own tabletop role playing game and learning it's very hard to make decisions on mechanics. But yeah, if I get up to anything, you can definitely find it over on my GitHub, which is at Jake plus plus JAKEPLUS, one word.
Okay, I can definitely add that to the show notes. That one I can do. I think that's going to wrap us up. Do you have anything else that you'd want to say to the audience?
No, I just encourage you look at web components. I really do think we are moving in a direction where we're going to see not only more adoption of web components, but I wouldn't be surprised if frameworks start using those as a de facto layer. And it's always good to understand the underlying technology to anything that you're using. So, yeah, give it a go. Go check out Lit, or just go check out MDN, their documentation on web components, and have fun.
Jacob, thank you so much for your time. I learned something, and I hope that everyone else who is listening in also learned something today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep, that will wrap up this episode of the Compile Time podcast. So make sure that if you have not yet, you've subscribed in whatever podcast player you want so you can get updates whenever new episodes come out and you don't miss the opportunity to learn something new. Have a great day.